You're listening to Salam Media.
So yesterday, the South Africa Investment Conference took place. We previewed it with Gulam Balam from the economist at Standard Bank, and set the scene in terms of what may happen. Right? I understand that the target was originally sort of 1.2, and it went up to 1.3 trillion. In fact, the amount received or pledged is 1.5 trillion. To make sense of all of that, and what does that mean to South Africa, and certainly what does it mean to you and me, let's find out from Rizwana Sumant, who's an economist. Rizwana, appreciate your time. Good morning, and assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Jazakallah for having me on your show.
Thank you. Okay, so 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.5. Should we get excited about this?
So I guess we have to take a look at developments over the last 5 years. The president has mentioned that investments in infrastructure development has totaled 263 billion rands during the last 4 years. However, on a floor level, on the ground level, it's very difficult to see investment or infrastructure development, on the ground, given that we've actually gone the other way in terms of significant municipal infrastructure deterioration. So it is very difficult to say how this either 1.1 or 1.5 trillion will drive sort of improvement in infrastructure and broad development and growth in South Africa over the next 5 years, given that growth has actually gone the opposite way, even though we have these 1.2 or 1.3 trillion rand in pledges already in the last 5 years. So it's difficult to say whether the increase in the pledges will actually result in better job creation or more growth in the next 5 years.
And just the one thing, I certainly know when it comes to fundraising, when it comes to pledges at fundraising events, you probably have at least 10, maybe even as much as 20% of pledges that actually do not get collected for whatever reason. Does the same apply here?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I was saying when it comes to fundraising events, right, in humanitarian aid issues, I think probably 10 at least or 20% at most of all pledges actually don't get collected. Whatever reason, people don't follow through on those pledges. Does the same apply to these investment pledges?
Indeed, yesterday we had the president and his economic advisor, Trudy Makaya, did admit that even though the initial target was 1.2 trillion and they have met and even exceeded this target in terms of pledges or promises for investment, only about 450 billion rands of that, so a third of that, has actually been invested in the country in terms of money flows and actual sinking investment in factories and buildings and expansions on the ground. So the rate from a government perspective in terms of this infrastructure drive is much lower than what you have mentioned initially. And of that 450 billion, various projects are not even completed, so they're on their way to completion. And so we do see the hurdle rate much higher for a country like South Africa that's experiencing significant challenges in the form of electricity constraints and high unemployment, etc.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday when we spoke to Gulam Bella, we made the point extensively about, South Africa just not that attractive at this point in time for reasons that you and I know. We don't have to even go into them. They're pretty obvious, right? But help me understand this, right? When we say 1.5 million, sorry, let me get that right. 1.5 trillion rands has been pledged at this South African Investment Conference, right? What do we, and I'm talking about the average person listening, what should we understand by the word investment here? Who are these people? Who are these organizations? What do they do? Do they channel it to government? Do they just set up businesses here? I'm just trying to understand what that means.
Yeah. In an ideal world, so in a developed market country, this type of investment will come from large multinationals, from mid-sized businesses in various industries, so mining, energy, property, telecoms, logistics, chemicals. It's basically all of the private sector businesses that you see around us, and some government or municipal level development. And very little of that commitment gets leaked out in terms of corruption and other type of inefficient spending. So in an ideal world, you're likely to see expansions of factories, actual infrastructure development and modernization, telecoms infrastructure improving, 5G, and even further more developed infrastructure and technology come through in a country. However, in South Africa, what we are faced with is obviously a crumbling public sector infrastructure, but even worse is the criminality that private sector businesses have had to face in the last few years. It has gotten worse. And so we don't think that all of those commitments will actually flow from a fund perspective and from a business expansion perspective over the next 5 years, purely because of the challenges that the country has, and in terms of addressing these, the progress has been very slow.
And I mean, do you have an insight into when these different companies from some of them local, others abroad, when they pledge these investment commitments, right? What's the backstory around it? I mean, how do they come about doing that? Is there a lot of brokering that takes place, or is it simply somebody arriving on our doorstep and say, "I want to invest in this part of the economy in your country"?
Yeah, it's very difficult to make the decision between new investments, so greenfield investments, and brownfield, so investments and expansions that were in the pipeline in any case before the investment conference. And that's what the government is struggling with as well, how to distinguish between brand new investments and investments that would have taken place otherwise without even its intervention. But I think what investors and multinational companies have identified in South Africa is a couple of strengths. So one being our very deep and liquid financial market. They have a very strong banking system and an excellent reserve bank, and even from a national treasury, from a fiscal policy perspective, those are our key strengths. We have a relatively strong judiciary relative to the rest of Africa, and so from a legal backing, there are strong sort of contractual strengths there. Those are where some of our key strengths are, and a lot of these multinationals look at South Africa, expanding into South Africa as a gateway into the rest of Africa, given how underdeveloped some of our African peers are. So those are some of the highlights that the investors have indicated that this is why they would like to either think in brand new investments or expand operations in South Africa.
Okay.
However, having said that, the challenges as I mentioned are well known.
So when President Ramaphosa announced yesterday that in fact the commitment is now 1.5 trillion, and he made the point that it's 300 or 400 billion more than we expected, and he said it's just whopping 1.5. There was this big hoo-ha in the audience. I wasn't there, but I certainly watched it. How was that received? Meaning, I mean, I think I think people like yourself, you never take things at face value. I would think that there's always questions that need to be asked about what are they really saying? What for you came through from that announcement?
Look, we have seen significant positive developments from the presidency itself, from National Treasury itself, and the different bodies that are keenly focused on attracting investment in South Africa. We never had this type of drive 5 years ago, and I think it's a step in the right direction in terms of the government's focus to be able to attract private sector investment and help private sector and large companies to actually sink these investments on the ground. So it's a step in the right direction. However, what we have seen in the actual data and in the numbers over the last 20 years or so is that fixed capital investment as a percentage of GDP has actually fallen. In terms of the National Development Plan, the target was to reach 30% of GDP in terms of investment values by 2030. We're currently about 17%. For the average emerging market country, that number should be 25%. So we're well behind, the target, and unlikely to achieve that by 2030. But I think, as an economist, looking at the pledges and at the commitment from government, from Invest SA, from Operation Vulindlela, from National Treasury, from all of the other government organs that are almost holding businesses' hands and helping them to break the bureaucracy, the red tape, and all of the other challenges that they face in terms of investment and expanding in South Africa. That is positive, that we actually have government helping businesses to expand, as opposed to previously businesses were alone in their efforts to be able to expand operations and obtain water licenses or register companies and that sort of thing.
And I think for most people, the terrain of just the ease of investing and just how smooth is that terrain. And for many of us living and working in South Africa, the ease of doing business is a very, very big issue indeed that we need to look at closely once again. Let's leave it at that, Rizwana. Sumana, appreciate your time. Thanks for enlightening us on what happened at the South Africa Investment Conference in Sandton yesterday. So there we are, 1.5 trillion rands ultimately is the amount now pledged. And what are the implications of that? We'll see. What are the implications of Aisha Kaji and her group of women, I'm saying that, who are spending some time in Itikaf at the Masjid Al-Aqsa. We'll get the story behind that right after this.